So in this video we're going to be talking about medium distortion in Star Wars. This is going to act as a sort of part 2 to my last video about why you shouldn't use feats to rank and scale Star Wars characters. And on that video a few people brought up some good points that I think were worthy of clarification in a separate video. So people brought up the point that unlike Mace Windu wiping out battle droids in original Clone Wars, that isn't mentioned anywhere ever again, it's just something that happens in original Clone Wars and then isn't mentioned in loads of source books, or it's not an integral part of Mace's character. Unlike that, people like Vishia and Nihilus who have drained planets, that's not just a throwaway feat, those feats are noted in the lore multiple times, and that's a firmly established part of that character's story. So did this character do this or did he not? And the answer is yeah, the character absolutely did still do that feat. But the way in which we perceive that feat is still viewed through the Foggy mirror. So let's take a look at the Foggy mirror. What is the Foggy mirror? Let's explain that. So the Foggy mirror is an analogy brought up by Lucasfilm officials when describing how continuity and all these things work. The Foggy mirror analogy implies that non-film sources, no matter how consistent, are still somewhat distorted reflections of the true Star Wars universe as seen in the films.
He also wanted it to be original, which is, I assume, why he accepted the idea of the Force being kind of amped up to 11 for all the Force users, that, you know, he thought that was perfect for a game. I don't think he thought that was perfect for, you know, the universe, but for the game, for the purposes of the game, that version of the universe, he was cool with that.
The further you get from the films, the more these distortions accumulate due to differences in media, artistic choices, gameplay mechanics, and storytelling. So we've got the canon fields, right? We've got G-Canon, T-Canon, and C-Canon. Now look at them canon fields for a second as their own mediums. So you've got the G-Canon medium, the T-Canon medium, and the C-Canon medium. Although the C-Canon medium is comprised of loads of different mediums because each author largely has their own medium. And even though a feat might be presented consistently throughout its own medium, so throughout the EU, throughout C-Canon, it's still not equivalent to how that would be depicted in the film medium, the true medium. So for example, we're looking at big feats, so the theme of feat is central to the character of Emperor Vishia and his story. However, even though it's consistent across multiple non-film sources, it still exists in a part of Star Wars that is prone to more exaggeration and interpretation, especially when compared to the film's portrayal of Force abilities. And that's because it's C-Canon, that's because there's so many different mediums that make up C-Canon, because there's so many different authors that are writing for it. So I'm not saying that the feat didn't happen, the feat absolutely happened and is canonical within the universe, but it's not absolute canon in the way the films are. The films act as the purest representation of the Star Wars universe, and everything outside of them, including T-Canon, is still subject to that medium distortion. Even highly consistent book-related events, like Nathema, is still a reflection of the truth that carries some distortion. So the idea is that the different mediums have different storytelling needs, and so different powers and events are often amped up or altered for dramatic or technical reasons. And the Nathema feat, though text-based, and not part of not like a big cutscene of flashy displays from a video game, even though it's from a book, it still represents a form of storytelling that isn't directly comparable to the grounded nature of the films. So it's still the same as The Force Unleashed amping up Force powers for gameplay, or 2003 Clone Wars portraying exaggerated Force powers for dramatic effect. Even though it's central to the Revan novel, the Nathema feat, it's still subject to the broader rule that non-film media contains some level of artistic distortion or exaggeration. And you might say, well, wouldn't it get into headcanon territory to try and rework these feats to how they might appear in the film medium? Because you're not going with what's actually portrayed in the lore, then you're just kind of making up how that might be portrayed in the film medium. And yet that is getting into headcanon territory, and we shouldn't exactly try and rework these feats. But it is important to acknowledge that while the event remains powerful in its own medium, it may not align perfectly with the film's portrayal of the Force. And this doesn't erase the event, it simply frames it as a reflection of an event through a lens of a different medium. The medium of text-based novels, guidebooks and sourcebooks still introduces distortion when compared to the films. It's not exclusive to video games. So every piece of Star Wars fiction is a window into the Star Wars universe, and some windows are clearer than others. The films are seen through a clear window, whilst material like the Clone Wars or the Expanded Universe is seen through a foggy one. So despite the Clone Wars 2008, the new Clone Wars, being a major project spearheaded by Lucas and having heavy Lucas involvement, it's still classified as T-Canon, television canon, rather than G-Canon. And the reason for that is because of the medium distortion. It's a cartoon, and with that comes inherent changes in tone, characterization, and just the way it's presented, and characters sometimes behave in more exaggerated, even childish ways due to the nature of the animation, because it is a cartoon. Like if you look at Anakin in the Clone Wars, he's a lot more childish and perky and happy than he is in the films. It's the same person, it's still Anakin, but he's portrayed differently because of the medium distinction. So those events in the Clone Wars, they actually happened. They were the true events. But it's all seen through that foggy mirror. Those characters aren't really so perky and childish and cartoonish in the way they act. They're actually acting the way they'd act in the films in reality, but we just see that through the foggy mirror. So it's not all about like power stuff. It's not all about feat scaling. This is just how continuity works and how Lucasfilm wants us to look at this. And so we're not really meant to look at it through the film medium. They want us to know that the film medium's how it all really happened, that that's how it really is. But we're not supposed to watch the Clone Wars and think about it in a film context. We're just meant to watch the Clone Wars and just know in the back of our mind that, yeah, it's meant to be in a film medium. And again, within the theme of feat, we don't really need to try and headcanon our way into how it would look in a film medium. Merely acknowledging that medium distortion exists is enough to dismiss feat as an accurate or consistent basis for comparison between characters' power levels. Every medium, whether that's books, games, comments, presents events in ways tailored to its format, whether that's through gameplay mechanics in video games, visual stylization, animation, or dramatic tension in novels. These distortions skew how we view displays of power, making it impossible to compare feats across mediums in a straightforward way. And so going back to Clone Wars 2008, though heavily guided by George Lucas, it's still below G-Canon. It's still not the true depiction of events, even though story-wise it is, but medium-wise it's not. The characters are portrayed like childish compared to the film versions, and that's because it's a different medium with a different target audience. Just knowing that we're looking through this foggy mirror is enough to know that these feats are not an accurate representation, not a consistent representation of a character's actual power. So power exists in the context of its medium. Because each medium distorts power to fit its narrative and visual needs, characters can be the strongest within their own context without needing to outdo feats from another medium. So Mace Windu in the original Clone Wars, who's destroying all these armies of battle droids, he can't do that in Attack of the Clones. Mace doesn't need to outdo his feats in the Clone Wars to have grown between the Clone Wars and Revenge of the Sith. He's not doing them feats in Revenge of the Sith that he's doing in the Clone Wars, but he's still stronger in Revenge of the Sith than he is in the original Clone Wars. And he doesn't need to destroy armies of battle droids to convey that, because the power is conveyed differently through those mediums. And so Vitiate can create like massive force storms, but Yoda and Obi-Wan might show the power through more measured, grounded displays of force abilities. It doesn't necessarily mean that those abilities are lesser per se, but they're simply different expressions of power suited to the medium of the story, the medium that they're in. For example, Palpatine is, his narrative, he's obviously one of the most powerful Force users ever, but he doesn't need to drain a planet to prove that. His power is communicated through his mastery of the dark side, through the story, through power in the context of that medium. His manipulations of the events across the galaxy, his control of the Force, his connections in the Force, his strength is integral to the film's narrative, and no amount of exaggerated feats from another medium diminishes any of that. Starkiller pulls down a Star Destroyer, and it doesn't mean that Yoda or other Jedi in the films are less powerful because they don't do something equally grand. Ultimately, power in Star Wars is more than just about like the size or scale of the feats. It's about the role the characters play in the galaxy, the connection to the Force, how many people they're connected to. And that's where medium distortion becomes key, because it allows characters to express their power in different ways without being constrained by the direct comparisons between vastly different types of media, between different mediums. And it doesn't just go one way either. It doesn't just allow characters to write characters with ridiculous over-the-top force powers, but it also allows characters from less exaggerated mediums to stand up there with characters from more exaggerated mediums. They don't need to one-up the massive crazy feats of a character in a really amped up medium to still be a threat that is greater than all time within their own medium, within their own context. So one author doesn't have to write their character blowing up a star to write their character as the strongest threat the Jedi has faced. Power manifests differently through different mediums, and the displays of power in less amped up mediums don't diminish the amount of power behind that display. The strength of the entire dark side could do very little in one medium and could blow up a star in another medium, but it's still the power of all the dark side. So for example, we talked about Darth Maul's narrative of being the most powerful Sith that the Jedi had ever faced up until that point in The Phantom Menace. Maul's role as the most powerful Sith up until that point is directly tied to the film's story and how he fits into the resurgent Sith. He doesn't need to have a feat that matches or surpasses Nihilus or Starkiller, because that narrative focus of the films doesn't require that type of escalation. And this applies to all characters, allowing them to exist as powerful entities within their respective stories without needing to be constantly compared to feats from other mediums. Authors don't care about feats, the story group don't care about feats. Scaling feats is a hobby that we do. It's not something they care about, they don't give a fuck about that. So it's always important to just see it how they'd see it, because that's how you're officially meant to do it. That is the official canon way of doing it. So if you want to be canonically accurate in anything that you do in Star Wars, in your rankings and your scaling, you have to abide by all of this, you have to acknowledge all of this. You can't just sit there and drool at the screen when Vitiate drains a planet. It's a lot more complicated than that. There's a lot more going into it than you'd initially realise. And it's that deeper level of understanding that we're exploring on this channel. So the films show us the truest depictions of the Force and how it flows and how it works. And this is where we see the clearest, most grounded representation of power. This is how power truly manifests. And while feats like Vitiate draining a planet or Mace Windu destroying armies of battle droids is impressive, and still definitely happened, it's exaggerated by the medium. You're still looking at it through the foggy mirror. And we're not necessarily meant to try and, rework that to fit with the film medium. We just know that it will have happened in a more grounded way. Maybe through some sort of external means. It's unclear. The point is that the very existence of this medium distortion is enough to completely write off using displays of power as an accurate gauge of how powerful someone actually is, because that's completely independent of the medium. And in the end, the foggy mirror of non-film media distorts the way we see power in Star Wars. Whether it's in a novel or comic or a game, the feats are tailored to fit the needs of that medium, but that doesn't necessarily reflect the true power levels of characters we see in the films. Power in Star Wars is about a whole lot more than just flashy displays. There's a whole spiritual, symbolic, religious element to it that is honestly really complicated and really fun, so we're going to explore all that on this channel. Feats like draining planets or pulling Star Destroyers down, whilst visually impressive, don't affect the film's established narrative about power and its meaning in the Star Wars universe, and can't be used as a basis for comparison when comparing to characters outside of that same medium. And it doesn't just go for the films, it goes for every time there's a medium difference. And one of the reasons the medium distortion's there in the first place is to allow for that, allow for the freedom, to not have to, one-up everyone. You can still have a bad guy that's a threat without having to have him scale off this guy, who scales off this guy, who scales off this guy, and constantly improve. Writers can still have the freedom to write a guy that works completely differently, that is more grounded than someone from those exaggerated mediums, and still have him be more powerful than the guy that blew up the planet. The way some people see it, by scaling all these feats, No one's a threat anymore, everyone just becomes a little bitch because they don't scale to the guy that drained the planet, so the whole narrative significance is taken away, and that's not how we're meant to view any of this. So again, we don't have to necessarily reduce all these feats to the film medium and then compare them. That would be getting into headcanon territory because we'd be going off the established lore to try and do that, right? We don't need to do that, but knowing that power manifests differently across these mediums allows us to dismiss these feats as a consistent or accurate way to measure a character's power. And so, now that we know we shouldn't use feats, we can look at other ways to measure a character's power, ways more entwined with the narrative. Because no author builds up their character by comparing feats, they don't make giant feat comparisons. They write stories, and believe it or not, if we read them stories without doing all these massive ridiculous feat comparisons, we can uncover the details in the stories, the functions of the Force, how the Force works, how it grows, different characters' relationships to the Force. It's all there, it's all hidden within the stories, it's all there for us to connect, the dots are there for us to connect, and that is a more accurate way to scale power characters in Star Wars. I'm going to go in depth in a different video on the best way to do this, how to scale characters in Star Wars accurately. Obviously the proof is in the videos I've already made, but I'm going to go into the details behind that, how you do that, the best ways to go about doing that. But it's all about looking at it from an author's point of view. Don't look at it from a versus debater scaling point of view, because that's going to yield nothing but headcanon conclusions. Going to do a video soon about the canon hierarchy, about power commentary in general, all that good stuff. So if you enjoyed the video, if you learned something new, give it a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in a bit.